talk, though, was inspired by a visit to Tower Hill many years ago, actually, when I first came across the this monument and plaque here, and it's a very poignant place, Tower Hill. For those of you that haven't been there, I thoroughly recommend you do. It's strange because it's just across Tower Hill Road. It's a very busy road. It's very noisy. This is sort of tucked away behind the Second World War memorial to the merchant seamen. Very unprepossessing. But when you're there is a strange tranquility there, and I think it's a very poignant and remarkable place. And what intrigued me when I saw it was this little thing in the bottom corner here. There's a little plaque. Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, 1747, and he's the last name of all the people named there, because he was the last person publicly beheaded on Tower Hill, the 9th of April 1747. Interestingly, there are other notable characters from the Jacobite sort of era there. That you can see James, Duke of Monmouth, who was executed for his part in the Monmouth Rebellion, and James Ratcliffe, 3rd Earl of Derwentwater, for his part in the 1715. Also, centre stage, if you like, there's this plaque on the left there to the Earl of Kilmarnock and Lord Balmerino, who obviously were executed for their part in the 45, a few months before the year before Lovett. And there are other notable people on there. There's Sir Thomas More and Sir Thomas Cromwell, who were executed for their part in Henry VIII's bid to secure his succession and to get a male heir, which is a bit of a theme actually in this talk. And the inscription there, most poignant of all, reads, the centre plaque there reads, "To commemorate the tragic history and in many cases the martyrdom of those for who the sake of their faith or country or ideals staked their lives and lost. On this site, more than 125 were put to death, the names of some of whom are recorded here." They're not all recorded there, but and it's a real sobering thought when you stand and think about that. Anyway, I found that moving and intriguing when I first went there. This photo was actually taken this April, shortly around about the anniversary actually of his execution. But then a few years ago, I was on Sword Beach at a place called Ouistreham, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in Normandy. And there was this imposing statue of another Lord Lovett, Brigadier Lord Lovat. In fact, Brigadier Simon Christopher Joseph Fraser, the Lord Lovett. And he led, he's commemorated here because he led his newly formed 1st Special Service Brigade ashore on D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, alongside his personal piper, Bill Millin, who famously played his pipes as they marched ashore. And his objective was to push on to Benneville to relieve the 5th Parachute Brigade, who had landed by glider earlier that morning in a very famous operation to secure the bridge over the canal there. Later became Pegasus Bridge, and where when as they approached the bridge to let the 5th Brigade know they were coming, his piper was piping, they could hear the pipes. And obviously the 5th Brigade's commanding officer was delighted to see them and welcomed them. And Lovett apparently replied very laconically, "I'm afraid we're a few minutes late, sir." And I thought, well, how were those, first of all, I thought, were those two Frasers related? And if they were related, how were they related? Or how were those Lovatts, Lord Lovatts, related? And how do you go from being an attained traitor executed on Tower Hill to a celebrated war hero in the space of 200 years? What happened in those 200 years to get from those two rather sort of momentous events, but also rather sort of extreme? So I think we have to go back and start with what I will refer to as the 11th Lord Lovett. All the others, I'll just refer to him as Lord Lovett. All the others I'll refer to as 12th, 13th, 14th, or whatever. But for me, this is Lord Lovett, Simon Fraser. He was the 11th Lord Lovett, but we'll just refer to him as Lord Lovett. And this is this very well-known portrait of him by William Hogarth, painted at or drawn at the White Hart Inn in St Albans, on his way to the Tower and his final sort of denouement, if you like. This isn't really a talk about him, because I'm not going to get into the rights and wrongs of his long and eventful life. There's, if you want to, and I'm sure many of you have, there's a very good book by Sarah Fraser, The Last Highlander. If you haven't read that, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a very good biography of Lord Lovett. But what is interesting is this plaque, or this on the right hand side there, this memorial plaque. Now, this was erected by Lord Lovett himself in the family mausoleum at the Wardlaw Mausoleum at Kirkhill near Inverness, and he erected this in honour of his father. But it's interesting if you look at the whole plaque, because it actually says, I'll read it for you because it might not be entirely clear on the screen there, but it actually says, to the memory of Thomas Lord Fraser of Lovett, who chose rather to undergo the greatest hardship of fortune than to part with the ancient honours of his house, and bore these hardships with an undaunted fortitude of mind. It then goes on to say, this monument was erected by Simon, Lord Fraser of Lovett, his son, who likewise, having undergone many and great vicissitudes of good and bad fortune through the malice of his enemies, he in the end, at the head of his clan, forced his way to his paternal inheritance with his sword in hand, and relieved his kindred and followers from oppression and slavery. And both at home and in foreign countries, by his eminent actions in war and state, he has acquired great honours and reputation. So that's Simon Fraser's memorial to his father. Is more a statement about what he thought about himself. Also, interestingly, at the bottom there in Latin, it says words to the effect of, "Here lie the bones of Simon Fraser, who suffered greatly for his clan." And that might be a reference to the fact that shortly after at some point after his execution, it was reputed that his body had been taken from the Tower of London to be placed in the family mausoleum, and possibly this Latin inscription was added at that time when they moved his, or reputedly moved his body. Actually, subsequent investigation and analysis of the bones that are in the crypt there would suggest that he's not there at all, and it's a different body, and he probably still is at the Tower of London. That's a whole different talk. If you ever get the chance to go to this mausoleum, if you're ever up sort of Culloden way, Inverness way, I recommend it. So I'll come back to it actually, because there's some other very interesting plaques there that help tell the story. So who were his descendants then? I mean, if he was executed on Tower Hill, who sort of came after him? Well, he had 3 sons by 2 of his wives. His eldest son was Simon Fraser, the Master of Lovett, and his youngest was Archibald Campbell Fraser by his 3rd wife, Margaret Primrose Campbell. His eldest son, the Master of Lovett, who was by his 2nd wife, Margaret Grant, he led the Clan Fraser in the 45, or nominally led them, I should say. But as luck or otherwise would have it, he was not present at Culloden. He had returned to Castle Dooney, the family seat, ostensibly to raise more men and bring them to Culloden. And instead, the Frasers were led on the battlefield by his cousin, Charles Fraser of Inverality. So Simon, the Master of Lovett, he wasn't at Culloden, and he wasn't. He went on the run after Culloden, but not for very long. After a few weeks, he gave himself up, and he was imprisoned at Edinburgh Castle. But he was eventually released in August 1747, and he received a full pardon actually in 1750. And I think that's because the authorities had probably accepted that he was a reluctant participant in following Prince Charles, and had probably been coerced and cajoled by his father. And also, I think, when he was released in August, remember his father had been executed just a few months before that, and they probably thought, that the family has sort of had its punishment, if you like. For whatever reason, he was released and pardoned, and he then went on to study law at Glasgow University. And interestingly, apparently, he represented the widow of Colin Roy Campbell against James Stewart in the notorious Appin murder trial of 1752. He didn't prosecute that trial, but he represented Colin Campbell's widow. Now, was that because he was actually sort of pro Campbell, pro government, or was it just he was just following the normal lawyers, barristers brief that you pick up whatever is the top case on the pile? You don't get to pick and choose who you represent. But anyway, that was his sort of first steps, I suppose, into rehabilitating and becoming part of the establishment. But in 1757, so this is about just 10 years or so after Culloden, he raised a regiment of foot that became known as the 78th Fraser Highlanders, not to be confused with the 78th Seaforth Highlanders who are pictured here. But I use this picture firstly because I don't have a picture of the 78th Fraser Highlanders, and secondly because this is from around a similar sort of period and certainly shows the sort of dress that they would have worn. And it's interesting that what the two regiments have in common, and I'll come back to the 78th Seaforth Highlanders later, but they both adopted the Highland dress as their uniform because it despite the prohibition under the Dress Act of 1746, it was permitted for military purposes. So he raised this regiment. They weren't exclusively from his estates. In fact, the numbers that were actually from his estates were 100 or so, I believe. The majority of them came from elsewhere, from lowland Scotland. But nevertheless, he raised a regiment that served the crown in Quebec. Actually, he accompanied them to North America, where he fought alongside James Wolfe at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec in 1759. That regiment was later disbanded in 1763 at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, and many of the men chose to remain in Canada. That's one of the reasons why there's still quite a strong Fraser Highlander group in Canada today. Anyway, Simon Fraser, in 1761, he was elected as an MP for Inverness-shire from a total electorate, I believe, of about 27. So that was back in the days when, unless you were landed gentry, you didn't get a vote. And so not particularly representative, you could say, but nevertheless, he was elected an MP. And in 1774, in recognition of his service to the army and the crown, he was allowed to buy back the Fraser estates, or he paid off their debts and reacquired the Fraser estates that had been confiscated on the attainment of his father. But he didn't get the title back. He was not a Lord Lovett, well, legally anyway, a Lord Lovett. In this talk, I will give him the designation of the 12th Lord Lovett, because de facto he was the 12th, but he wasn't actually de jure, as they say. He wasn't legally. Anyway, he went on to become a founding member of the Highland Society of London, and that was set up to promote the interests of the Highlands, particularly to repeal the 1746 Dress Act. And he married, but he died childless in London at the age of 56 in 1782. So then, if you like, the title didn't, but the estates fell to his half-brother, Archibald Campbell Fraser. Now, we'll talk a little bit about him, but I'll just go back now to the mausoleum. where Fraser's, and again, just to show you what the 11th Lord Lovett thought of himself, that's his tablet in the middle there. The one on the left is Archibald Campbell, his younger son's tablet. And the one on the right, which I'll go through both of them in a minute, is to other Frasers. In fact, the master of Lovett, Simon Fraser, he's not actually mentioned up there. But anyway, it is quite as I say, this Wardlaw Mausoleum is an extraordinary place, and I thoroughly recommend you visit. And I'm indebted actually to Eric Lundberg for access and information to this about the mausoleum, because he lives in the house next door and he actually holds the key. He's got the key to get into this place. So yeah, you need to call him, or well, if you're lucky, he'll be in when you get there. But otherwise, you need to pre-book and pre-arrange if you want to go and visit. So let's look at Archibald Campbell first. That's his plaque on the left there, and it basically talks about. Well, I'll come back to what he says about himself. But Archibald Campbell, he went to school in Inverness. It's alleged that he bunked off school on the day of the Battle of Culloden to actually go and watch it. So he would only been his 10th birthday actually, and he apparently saw the Frasers, his clansmen, basically getting severely beaten. It probably had quite a lasting impression on him. He, like his half brother, he went on to Glasgow University, and he went into the diplomatic service, and he was the British consul in Tripoli and Algiers, sort of North Africa, between 1764 1777. But he also was a member of the Highland Society of London, and he also inherited his brother's parliamentary seat. I don't know if you can inherit the seat exactly, but I guess he was just a sort of a shoe-in to take the seat after his brother's death. And he actually seconded the motion to repeal the Dress Act. So he had a strong part in actually repealing the Dress Act, which was repealed in 1782. He was also a colonel of the 1st Inverness Shire Militia, and in 1794 he raised what they call a Fencible regiment. It's a short form of defensible regiment. It was like a sort of home guard that they set up in various places around the country to counter the threat of the French invasion during the Napoleonic Wars. The Fencibles were not part of the army. They were, and in fact, they got rid of the Fencible regiments early in the 1800s and replaced them with called up militia who were part of the army. But he, like his brother, was getting involved in the military, in politics, in diplomacy. He was becoming an established part of the establishment. So in this tablet, he basically says, that he was a diplomatic. He procured the indemnification from the Empire of Russia. His 10-year stay in North Africa, by his king's permission, he redeemed the Spanish, Portuguese, and imperial subjects at the expense of those cost 2 million sterling, while not a single Briton was sold or taken into slavery. At his own expense and in person, he surveyed the fisheries on the west coast of Scotland and Hebrides. He petitioned for the repeals of duties on salt and coals. He encouraged the manufacture of coarse wool, hemp, and flax. He laboured to improve the soil. He amended the breed of Highland oxen. And by affording employment to a hardy race of men returned from serving their country in the wars, he repressed emigration and preserved to his country their equally valuable services in peace. It says there, it goes on to say, after quelling an insurrection on the 10th of August, 1792, I think it was, I'm not quite sure what insurrection that relates to, he planned the system of legally putting arms into the hands of men of property, and had, when the empire was threatened by invasion, the satisfaction of seeing its adoption and efficacy. So again, like his father, he wasn't a modest person. He liked to tell people about his achievements. But you can see from that, he by the time he died in December 1815, the Frasers were really now, an accepted part of the establishment, and that's shown on the tablet on the right hand side there, which is to some of the other Frasers. It starts off in memory to Archibald Campbell's wife, Jane Fraser. It does mention Lord Lovett being beheaded. It calls him there, by the way, it calls him the 12th Lord Lovett, and there's always a little bit of confusion of exactly how many Lord Lovetts there are, because some were perhaps not recognised as such. So I've generally seen Simon Fraser, the one that got executed, as the 11th Lord Lovett, even though on this tablet he's referred to as the 12th. But some of the other people here, these were related to Lord Lovett, but I think they were like uncles and things. And you've got one of them, Sir James John Fraser. He was a 3rd baronet of Lediclune and Mora. He was a lieutenant colonel with the 7th Queen's Own Regiment of Hussars, fought at Orthez, Toulouse and Waterloo, and he in fact was wounded at Waterloo. You've got Keith Fraser there, who was a lieutenant in the Enniskillen Dragoons. And last of all, you've got Sir William Augustus Fraser. He was the 4th baronet. He was an MP. He was a captain of the 2nd troop of the 1st regiment of Life Guards for the Queen's bodyguard. And he was the one that erected this tablet in 1876, and he died in 1898. I've often thought all the Frasers tend to be called Simon, Thomas, Hugh. There's the occasional William there, but this chap is called William Augustus. Now that's strange names to be chosen by staunch Jacobites, you would argue. I think his parents anyway are kind of trying to say, yeah, we're fully behind the Hanoverian succession here. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is here that by the late 1800s, the Frasers were well and truly re-established, if you like. So this is their family seat. This is actually, this is confusingly referred to as Beaufort Castle, but also Castle Dooney. This is a sort of Victorian period building. It was the original Castle Dooney, which was the Fraser seat, was destroyed by on the Duke of Cumberland's orders after Culloden, and it was rebuilt and gradually expanded upon until this sort of palatial baronial mansion was finished in the 1880s. It's no longer in the Lovett family. They sold it in 1994 to, funny enough, the Stagecoach, to Anne Gloag, who's one of the directors and owners of Stagecoach. It was sold by the current, or no, not the current 15th Lord Lovett, to pay some of his inheritance taxes. But what's interesting about this place, and it's one of the things that really, really touches me when I visit these places and my interest in history, is that in 1949, the then owners, who would have been Lovetts at that time, they built this gate and this adjoining wall. And to the left, to the right, are the ruins of the original Castle Dooney. Very little of it left. There's just an overgrown wall covered in ivy, and it really doesn't look like any building at all. But it is the original Castle Dooney, destroyed by the Duke of Cumberland. And then to the right is the garden wall of the new Beaufort Castle, or Castle Dooney. But there's a little plaque there you can see here, and it says on that, this arch, completed in June 1949, joins Beaufort with the ruins of Castle Dooney, the ancient stronghold of the Frasers of Lovett, built circa 1400 and destroyed by Cumberland after the Battle of Culloden in 1746. And for me, that's just a real lovely physical connection between the past and the present. So you can visit. It's not open to the public, but you can kind of get into the grounds here and go and see this if you're ever that way. So what happened after Archibald Campbell's death in 1815 was the question arose, well, he died childless. I should just perhaps back up, actually, sorry. I'll just go back a bit. Yes, here we go. Too much. Right, here we go. Yeah, here's Archibald Campbell, died 1815. He had 5 sons. Now, if you had 5 sons, you would think you'd secured your succession. But sadly, in those days, that wasn't necessarily the case. And his 5 sons all predeceased him. They didn't all die in childbirth. Some of them, well, one here was an MP, but they did predecease him. And that must have been, Archibald Campbell himself lived to a fairly ripe old age, but it must have been quite distressing to see your sons and heirs gradually, one by one, predecease you. Consequence of there was no and is no direct descendant of the 11th Lord Lovett. His line died out with his son. So the question then arose in 1815, well, who inherits the Lovett? Well, the Lovett estates, not the title, but at this point, the title had still not been reinstated. And this is a family tree. I'm not expecting you to follow the whole family. I've only highlighted the 2 important ones here in red. Here's the 11th Lord Lovett, you know, our sort of centre piece, if you like. The one beheaded in 1747, and here's his son Archibald. The 12th Lord Lovett, well, the 12th Lord Lovett de jure, i.e. reinstated, was right over here. So you have to go when this came to court to see which heir should inherit. They went back about 5 generations, I think, to the fourth Lord Lovett's sons. So here you've got the 5th Lord Lovett, and it went right over to his what would have been.
What I did. Lord Lovett was the last one to get executed in Britain. What have you done?
Is someone trying to make a comment?
If you can hear me, Craig, I don't know what that was all about, but unmute yourself, will you please?
Sorry. Right. When was I muted?
You were muted because I muted everybody.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Okay. So if you're still with me anyway, still fine.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So the point I'm saying with this particular thing here, this was put together by the people who were arguing the court case, and this chap Eric Lumsden at Wardlaw Museum, he's got a whole library of books on the Frasers, and he showed me the original family tree that was published for this court case. So this is just a reproduction of it. But anyway, the point is, you know, they went back 4 or 5 generations and then back down the other side of the tree. So the Lovett that inherited the states was sort of I don't know. The 11th Lord Lovett would have been the great uncle, and this is the sort of first cousin thrice whatever removed. I'm no genealogist, but the point I'm making here is it was a bit of a leap to the down a different branch of the family tree. So the current Lord Lovetts are not descended from the 11th Lord Lovett, but they are related, and we'll see. We'll see. You know what that means. All right, there we go. Oops. Yeah. So the title was inherited by Thomas Alexander Fraser of Lovett and Stricken. I guess he was from Stricken originally, and he became what I'm calling the 14th Lord Lovett de facto, because remember you had the Master of Lovett was the 12th, and then you had Archibald Campbell as the 13th. So I'm calling this guy the 14th Lord Lovett de facto. But in fact, the Lovett titles were restored. They weren't restored until I think it was 1854 that the attainder on the 11th Lord Lovat had been reversed, and so this chap Thomas Fraser, he then became the 12th Lord Lovat de jure. And it is a bit confusing because you will hear people refer to both. So when people talk about the 16th Lord Lovat, you have to be check where, is that de facto or de jure? Probably most official documents will be de jure, i.e. in law. But in sort of a nod to 11th Lord Lovat and his sons, I've used the de facto numbering. So you can see here that the line carried on. I guess by then health and what have you was improving, and it was more likely that your sons would survive. So Simon Fraser, they're all called Simon. The firstborn, it's a tradition, is called Simon, the master. So you can see he was a chairman of the Highland Railway Company. And then we get to really the interesting one for me anyway, was Major General Simon Fraser, the 16th Lord Lovat, born 1871, who was the founder of the Lovat Scouts. And it was actually his son, Brigadier Simon Fraser, whose statue it is on Sword Beach, and he commanded the 1st Special Service Brigade. And there is now a current Lord Lovat, born in 1977, the 18th de facto or 16th de jure. So let's talk a little bit about the Lovat Scouts now. During the early stages of the Second Boer War, which kicked off around 1899, the British Army at that time was really struggling to gain an accurate information about Boer tactics. It was their country, or at least certainly their territory, and their fieldcraft. They knew the land. They were excellent sharpshooters, trackers, and it made them a very elusive opponent. And the British suffered painfully. Their deficiencies were painfully exposed during what they called Black Week in December 1899, where 2,776 British soldiers were killed, wounded or captured in 3 battles that pretty much in the same week, battles of Stormberg, Margersfontein and Colenso. And in light of that, it was Lord Lovat who suggested raising a new specialist regiment from his Highland estates, using the stalkers and the shepherds, gamekeepers, gillies. He realised that those guys had exactly the sort of skills that you needed in a country like South Africa against an enemy like the Boers, because they were good stalkers, they were good trackers, they had good eyesight, they were good at using field telescopes rather than binoculars. They had their Highland ponies that were well adapted to the terrain. So we have here in the Highlanders Museum, where I now volunteer, this letter written by the Lord Lovat on January the 4th, 1900, from Beaulieu. So he would have been in that Beaufort Castle that we saw earlier. And I'm not sure who this is. I can't quite read that name. It looks like Doc 4 or something. I'm not sure who he was. But anyway, he says what he says here is, I've been authorised by the War Office to raise a corps of 150 gillies, stalkers and picked men for primarily scouting services in South Africa. At a meeting at the club at Inverness yesterday, Wednesday, 3rd of January, it was unanimously resolved to ask you to assist in the recruiting of any suitable men in the district of, and I'm not quite sure I can't quite read that, but it might be something like Caithness or something, the district of Caithness, let's say. The terms of service are as follows: investment for 1 year or to the conclusion of the war, if sooner. So that was him basically saying, yep, they'd agreed that he could raise this regiment, and he was now putting the word out to his, I guess, his sort of underlings or whatever, to say, right, well, see if any of the men are interested. And many of them were. They raised a contingent. They went out to South Africa in March in 1900, and the tactics immediately transformed the British intelligence gathering. They pioneered the use of the ghillie suit, the sort of the all-piece camouflage suit. They travelled on their ponies, they used their spyglasses, they communicated with heliograph and semaphore, ideal heliograph in particular, in that kind of terrain to get your message across. Remember, this is all pre-radio. And they fully justified Lord Lovat's faith in bringing these Highland skills to the battlefield. And there's a very nice memorial to them in Beaulieu. And there it is, you can see on that bronze tablet there, you can see that two of the Lovat Scouts with their Highland pony and with their telescope doing what they did. After they were there for 1 year, and because they'd only signed up for 1 year, so after 1 year they came home. The Boer War continued until May 1902, so two further companies, I guess you would call them, were raised, and they went out. It wasn't, I mean, they were involved in the fighting. In fact, quite a few of them were killed. But you can see from this photo here that we have in the museum, a pretty swarthy, tough-looking bunch, not the sort you'd really want to meet in a fight. And there they're using a lot more than just hunting rifles. That looks like sort of Gatling guns. So yeah, pretty fierce bunch, and fully justified Lord Lovat's faith in them. After the success of in the Boer War, they were disbanded immediately afterwards, but they then became sort of Imperial Yeomanry from 1902 to 1908, and then they eventually formed. They took on the hunting Fraser tartan, the badge of the Frasers, the Royal Stag. They adopted the Fraser motto, "Je suis prêt," I'm ready. And they formed, there was actually 2 regiments of scouts and a 10th battalion that was part of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, served in World War I, primarily defending the home front, but some battalions were stationed in Gallipoli. In fact, I think they covered the retreat from Gallipoli. Salonika, Macedonia, in what is, I guess it's present day Greece, isn't it? But it was back then Macedonia. And in 1916, Lord Lovett formed the Lovat Scout Sharpshooters, which was a force of 9 observer groups, each group consisting of an officer and 20 men. And they were deployed on the Western Front for specific tasks such as close observation of the enemy or providing detailed intelligence of enemy lines before an attack. A bit more of a static role on the Western Front, but if men were going over the top, they needed to have the best possible information of what they were going into, and the Lovat Scouts provided that. They were resurrected in World War II. They provided garrison force on the Faroe Islands, and then they were sent to Canada for sort of mountain training. 1943, they were sent to Italy in July 1944, so they're part of the Italian campaign until the German surrender in May 1945. In 1967, they were disbanded as a separate scouting unit. They were actually absorbed into the 3rd Battalion of Queen's Own Highlanders. And then they went on to become the Battalion of Highland Volunteers, and now they don't exist per se. I mean, obviously, scouting and warfare today is completely different. It's done by drones now, and goodness knows what. So they don't exist as a separate sort of entity. However, because the army likes to have these links with the past, the cap badge of the Lovat Scouts is carried on by the Orkney Independent Cadet Battery of the 1st Battalion of the Highland Army Cadet Force. And they were actually visiting Fort George, the museum at Fort George, the Highlanders Museum at Fort George last week. And I saw the cadets, and it's right enough, they've all got these little flashes on their sleeves that says Lovat Scouts. So, it's a nice little touch. Again, it's what I've said before about this touch points between the present and the past. So I'll just finish up a little bit with, how did the rest of the, you know, the rest of the Highland regiments appear, because if you look at it, this chart here shows the formation of the Highland regiments over the years. Now, what we have there is this timeline down the side here from sort of 1600 to the present day, but the key line there is Culloden 1746. You can see prior to that there were Highlanders in the army. The Earl of Mar raised a regiment, the Royal North British Fusiliers, Hepburn's regiment, Royal Regiment of Foot, Temple's regiment from the Earl of Leven, and Crawford's Highlanders, who became or were derived from the Black Watch, the 42nd Highland regiment that then went on to become the Black Watch. But I'm particularly interested in these ones here, which are you have the 78th Regiment of Foot, the Sea Force. Remember, I talked about them earlier. You have the 79th Regiment of Foot that went on to become the Camerons, or the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. What were eventually amalgamated into 92nd Regiment of Foot, the Gordon Highlanders, and then you've got the Argyll and Sutherlanders. And as the army has contracted and reorganised over the years, the key sort of change, I guess, was 1960 when the Sea Force and Camerons became the Queen's Own Highlanders, and 1993 when they joined with the Gordons. And actually in 2006, all of these infantry regiments were combined into one regiment, the Royal Regiment of Scotland. However, it's one regiment, but it has 7 battalions. And the 3rd battalion is the Black Watch, but the 4th battalion is the Highlanders. It's the Sea Force, the Camerons, and it's got the stag of the Sea Force on their cap badge now. And, you know, a key part of the British Army. And just finally, this map sort of shows this is from 1890, so probably the peak of the army's sort of size, or at least certainly its geographic recruitment. And it's very much sort of clan based, if you like. It's the Camerons traditionally recruited from here, from Lochaber and Skye, the Sea Force from Clan Mackenzie here around Ross and Cromarty, and actually even up into Sutherland and Caithness. Gordon Highlanders from Murray and some sort of Aberdeenshire, and the Black Watch here in Perth. And these little cross swords represent the different garrisons dotted across the country. So, you know, heavily militarized at that point, or at least heavy recruitment going on. And then here's all the lowland regiments. So, yeah, very, very much, you know, the Highlanders went from Culloden as being sort of obviously, well, some of the Highlanders are seen as the enemy, to, you know, transformed into an absolutely key and integral part of the British Army through the likes of the Lovets and others. So I'll just finish now with a final word, and this is a recruitment poster from the museum. And I must plug the museum here, the Highlanders Museum, Queen's Own Highlanders collection at Fort George, Ardesseer, open every day except Christmas and New Year. And I volunteer there a couple of days a week. And one of my favourite exhibits they have all these recruitment posters. And this is a recruitment poster from the 1960s. It's after the merger of the Sea Force and Camerons, it's the Queen's Own Highlanders. You can tell it's the 1960s because it's got a Wessex helicopter, and the khaki uniform that they're wearing is of that period. But what I like about it is this chap here, very, very clearly a Highlander and a Jacobite Highlander, because he's got a blue bonnet and a little white cockade there. And I think the artist that drew this poster has put that in there as a very deliberate nod to the regiment's past, and not just their Highland past, but in a way their Jacobite past. So, if you like, it's a slightly contrived ending as to why a talk of the 1745 association should end up talking about the British Army in the present day. But that, for me, again, is that touch point between, you know, the present and the past. So I will end there. I think that's more or less time. Yes, maybe slightly over. And if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to